So thank you very much for that introduction. It's especially meaningful to be here because the LSE's own School of Public Policy has a collaboration with the Munk School, which is growing by leaps and bounds and which we hope to expand going forward. So it's really nice here to be with our partners and also with many old friends in the audience. So I'm going to talk to you about my book, and let me start by explaining why I wrote it. Right around 2016, as many of you will remember, lots of things in the world changed. We had Trump elected, we had Brexit in the UK, we had a wave of populist politicians elected around the world. And I was incredibly puzzled where all the anger that was fueling that political movement was coming from, particularly after I had spent about 25 years of my life working on international development and had seen the huge progress that humanity had made in recent decades in terms of higher life expectancy, nutrition, education levels. And I couldn't understand, why is it that we've had all this objective human progress and yet people in so many societies are so angry and frustrated and disappointed? And that anger manifested itself in politics, in political life. And I increasingly came to the view that the problem wasn't so much capitalism per se, but the fact that the social contract that underpins a market economy had broken and hadn't kept up with societal changes. And that many of us, most of us, were still living in societies where the social contract was no longer relevant to the world we lived in. Now, what do I mean by the social contract? I mean the set of mutual obligations that we have in a society at the level of individuals, families, communities, the state, and with our employers, and how those mutual obligations are defined. And in most societies, until recently, that social contract had many assumptions, like people would get married and have children only in marriage, that most people would work for 2 or 3 employers over the course of a lifetime, that children and old people would be looked after by women for free, that most people would only live a couple of years after they retired, and the care they needed in old age would be provided by the women in their families. Now, as I've described those assumptions, many of you are thinking that this bears no relationship to the society that I live in anymore. And I think the fact that it bears no relationship is a key reason why our social contract is broken. Now, the social contract, I think what broke the social contract are 2 big drivers over the recent decades: the changing role of women, who no longer could care for the young and the old for free, and secondly, the role of technology and how technology has changed work and meant that work is much more flexible, and the fact that people will change jobs more often, and what we need from our educational systems as a result is fundamentally different. There are 2 other big drivers in addition to the changing role of women in technology, and that is the role of aging and the impact of climate change, which has fundamentally altered the intergenerational social contract. Now, I want to start just by providing a point of clarification, because when I say social contract, many people think of the welfare state, and I define it much more broadly than that. And these are numbers from the UK, which show the citizens' interaction with the state at different ages, which is on the x-axis, and the kind of net position with the state on the y-axis. And what it shows you is that when you're young, you're basically a beneficiary of the welfare state. Because you benefit from basically investment in education when you're young. When you're middle-aged, you're a net recipient. You give money to the state through your taxes because you're working. And then when you're older, you once again become a net taker from the state because of pensions and healthcare spending. And many people think the role of the state, and the welfare state in particular, is what we call the Robin Hood function, taking money from the rich, giving it to the poor. Actually, that's a very small part of what the state does. The most important thing that the state does is what I call the piggy bank function. It invests in us when we're young, it asks us to pay into the piggy bank when we're middle-aged, and then it spends on us when we're old. And that redistribution of income over our own lives is a key part of the social contract. So it's not about redistribution. It's about redistribution among us. It's about redistribution across our own lives. And I think that's a very important part of understanding what the social contract is about. So let me give you some examples of areas where, in the book, I sort of am inspired by William Beveridge, who was one of my predecessors at the LSE, who wrote the famous Beveridge Report, which created the modern welfare state in the UK and founded the NHS and so on. And Beveridge talked about cradle to grave. And so in the book, I go from cradle to grave, how we raise children, how we educate them, what happens in the workplace, what happens when we get old or sick. But let me give you 3 examples of stages of life in which the social contract is broken and how I think a better one could look like. And let's start with education. So this chart shows where countries spend money on education. And in all countries, we've made massive improvements in access to education. But most of our money is spent in primary, secondary, and tertiary education. The dark bar at the beginning, which is pre-primary, and adult learning, which is the end of the bar, is by far in most countries the smallest. And yet I would argue that in a world in which people's careers will no longer be about 30 years, but for the young people in this room, it'll be about 50 years that you'll be working, given life expectancy. And if you are going to work 50 years, the idea that you get all your education from age about 6 to your early 20s is mad, given changes in technology and so on. And so that would seem to argue for an educational system that spent a lot more in adult years. The other thing we know from lots of research on early years is that most of the really important brain development happens between the age of 0 to 3, before a child ever sees a school. And yet most countries underinvest terribly in that age. And if you care about social mobility, that is where the most effective interventions happen in those early years. If children get good nutrition and mental stimulation in those early years, they then go on to have much more successful lives. And if they don't, no matter how good a school you put them in, after that, they never catch up. And so if you care about social mobility, the early years, pre-primary, are much more important. And so I would argue a better social contract would change the shape of our educational system so that we do much more early and much more later. Let me give you another example, which is the world of work. I already said, technology has meant that the world of work has become much more flexible. A much higher proportion of workers work on flexible contracts, and people will often work for 2 or 3 employers in a week rather than a lifetime. And yet our social contract has not kept up with that huge increase in flexibility, which will frankly only get more post-pandemic with much more flexible working from home and so on. So this chart shows how different countries strike a balance between flexibility of the labor market and the security that they offer workers. And on the bottom side is left to right, more flexibility, top to bottom, more security. Now, most continental European countries are in the upper left-hand quadrant, where you have low degrees of flexibility in the labor market, very hard to hire and fire people, and high levels of social protection. And so workers get generous severance payments and unemployment insurance and so on. Many developing countries, paradoxically in some ways, are in the lower left-hand quadrant, where you have in the formal sector, where a very small proportion of the labor force is employed, you have very low flexibility, and you have very low social protection for everyone. But for informal sector workers, you have very high flexibility and low social protection. Now, the sweet spot is in the upper right-hand corner. The countries that have managed to have very flexible labor markets, but provide individual workers with high levels of protection. In those countries, you often have, it's very easy to hire and fire workers. In fact, many workers don't even get notice periods or severance. So very flexible and advantageous to employers. On the other hand, if you do lose your job, your unemployment insurance is very generous, something like 80% of your previous wage. So you don't experience a sudden drop in your living standards. In the UK, for example, unemployment insurance is like 30% of your previous wage or less. Meanwhile, you're very quickly put into retraining programs, and within a year, almost everybody's back in work. And so individual workers are protected, but employers get the benefits of flexibility. And I think this is another good example where the world of work has changed, but the social contract around work hasn't kept up. And I think the model of what is often referred to as flex security would be a much better way to deal with the technological changes that we see in the world of work. Let me then finally talk about the intergenerational social contract. This is a result of polling which asks people, do you think your children will have a better or worse life than you? And what's really striking is that most of the rich countries are at the bottom, where most parents think their children will be less well off than they are. Whereas most poor countries are still at the top, where the expectation is that the next generation will be better off. Now, what's driving these differences? I think there are many dimensions. One is that debt is an issue. Younger generations these days, particularly post-financial crisis and post-COVID, are inheriting big legacies of debt. Second, the nature of work and the jobs they can aspire to, and what's particularly happened to housing prices in many advanced economies has meant that younger people do not expect to be able to afford a home and do the kinds of things in their young adult life that previous generations were able to do. And then thirdly, and probably the biggest issue, is climate change. That we're leaving the next generation an environmental legacy that is far smaller than what we inherited. And if you look, Dasgupta has done some very interesting work on human, physical and natural capital over decades. And you can see that we are leaving the next generation a lot more physical capital, roads, buildings, transport systems, etc. We're leaving them with a bit more human capital than we had, but we're leaving them far less natural capital endowment than we inherited. And clearly, there needs to be some righting of that wrong. And I would argue that this is another domain in which the social contract between the generations is broken, and our generation needs to do a much better job of restoring some of that natural capital, because they are not completely substitutable between each other. And then finally, let me just say something about social mobility. Part of the reason that I think the social contract has spilled over into politics is that people's expectations of their lives are not what they expect, or not what they had hoped for. And social mobility is a really good example of that. This chart shows how many generations it takes to go from the bottom of the income distribution to the middle in different societies. And you can see that, say if Canada's on that chart. Yeah, there's Canada. In Canada, it takes 4 generations. In the UK, it takes 5. In the US, it's 5. If you look at the Nordic countries, who are always at the top of these things, within 2 or 3 generations, you can expect to be middle class if you start off poor in society. And of course, in many developing countries, it takes 7 to 11 generations, which means if you're born poor, you have no hope of ever making it. Remember, these are averages. You know, there's always the example of the one poor kid who grew up in a slum and who happens to be a billionaire. Those are complete outliers. These are aggregate numbers, averages for society as a whole. And so unless we can offer people better prospects for their lives, I think we will see the kind of levels of anger and dissatisfaction that we see in society. So what do I think a better social contract would look like? And I think there are 3 principles that can guide us to developing a better social contract. The first is that every society should be able to provide a minimum below which no one should go, a floor below which everyone should expect to have. And I include poor countries in that category. So in many, many poor countries today, you have cash transfer schemes that transfer cash to very low-income households and provide a floor on nutrition levels and being able to keep your kids in school and so on. In rich countries, there's a lot of talk about universal basic income. I am not a fan, and we can talk about that in the Q&A, but I think the universal basic income is inefficient, And it fundamentally violates the principle of the social contract in almost every society in the world, which is if you're an able-bodied adult, you're expected to contribute in exchange for being looked after when you're young and you're old. And I think we can do better than universal basic income. We can have earned income tax credits. We can have negative tax schemes. We can do all sorts of things to protect the bottom of the income distribution and provide some protection there. The second principle is maximum investment in capability, where we should be investing maximally to enable people to have a good life. And that's where investments in things like early years education and lifelong learning become even more important. One of my favorite studies that I cite in the book is a piece of research done in the United States called Lost Einsteins. And they look at children in year 4 across the United States using these massive big data sets who have exactly equivalent math and science skills in year 4. And then they look at income data and patenting data and look at which of those kids go on to have high incomes and to be inventors and have many patents. And what they find is that if you're born into a rich family, you're 10 times more likely to have patents than if you're born into a poor family, controlling for having exactly the same math and science skills in year 4. So these are kids who are equally capable, and yet the family you happen to be born into has such a huge consequence for your ability to use your talents. Similarly, if you're born in Silicon Valley, you are 10 times more likely to have a technology patent. And if you're born in Minnesota, you're much more likely to have a medical devices patent. So where you were born and the family you're born into have huge consequences for your expected lifetime earnings. And of course, who loses from that? Obviously, the individuals lose a great deal, but society is losing because all of the talents of those lost Einsteins are lost to society. And so creating social policies which enable those talents to flourish, like early years education, are really, really important. So that's my second principle, maximum investment in capability. My third principle is managing risks more intelligently. So many of the reforms that we've seen in economics over the recent decades, what some would call the neoliberal consensus, have resulted in shifting risks onto individuals. Think about the risks around work and flexible working, where now individuals carry the risks of how many hours they'll work, what their income will be from week to week. Think about the move toward defined contribution pension schemes, where now individuals, 90% of whom don't know the difference between a stock and a bond, have to manage pension pots for their lives that will determine their income security in later life. And we've pushed that risk onto individuals when actually that would be a risk that would be much more sensibly managed collectively. So I think we need to look across a whole array of areas and identify areas where we're managing risks in an illogical way, and a better social contract would do that in a way that would reduce risks that are being borne by individuals. So I hope I've persuaded you that our current arrangements are a huge part of the problem that we see in our societies, but that there's also a better way of doing it. And there are already countries out there that are finding better ways to get a better balance between creating opportunity for individuals, but also providing people with higher levels of security. And I would argue that if we applied those three principles, minimum security for all, maximum investment in capability, and a better balance of sharing of risks, we would do a much better job of creating societies that are both prosperous and also happier. And a better social contract is the best way to begin to have a conversation about those challenges. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Audience questions. So thanks. I'm going to turn it over to audience questions after I ask just one. And I'll ask if you've got a question. I don't think we have microphones in the room, but you can stand up. We do. Okay, so we'll hand them around when we come. Normally we take questions on cards because we can't trust people to ask a question that has an interrogatory at the end, but I know you will. So, so before we do that, let me ask one question of you, which is, I'm trying to understand it's a wonderful book and it's a wonderful argument, and I'd like you to give us a sense, because there's a lot of policy people here, about the stage of the problem that we're at. And is it such that the problem is that, in your experience with policymakers, they actually can't find terms to describe the problem? Or is it that they just feel like they don't have the tools or the policy imagination to confront this? Because I'll just confess that as one listens to this, and you root the problem actually in a quite deeply social way, that it has to do with our relationships with each other, our understanding of family, our expectations of each other over the whole life cycle. It's not just that labor laws have changed. It's something much deeper than that, right? So do you have a sense that policymakers understand the depth of that, and they just lack the solutions and they lack the tools? Or is it the case that we need to find a way to educate them about the depth of the problem? And if so, how does one do that?
So I think, obviously, it varies hugely by country. And I think there are some policymakers out there that are trying to figure this out. I mean, funnily enough, I was in Singapore last week, and the Singaporeans I spent 2 hours with the future prime minister, and they're rewriting what they're calling their social compact, and thinking really hard about just some of these issues. But of course, Singapore is a very unusual place, and they're very forward-looking, and they are very organized, and it's a small place, and they could actually do this. But they are looking at expanding their lifelong learning entitlements and looking at different ways of dealing with aging and how to help older people remain productive for much longer. So there are a few policymakers and a couple in Europe that I've spoken to who are thinking about it. I think what ends up happening is that most policymakers see this as a issue by issue. Everybody knows that during COVID, flexible workers had problems. They were the first ones to be fired. They couldn't take sick leave if they were sick. So suddenly people are very focused on, what do we do about that issue? Oh my goodness, we're aging societies and we don't have enough care workers. Oh, what do we do about that issue? And so I guess what I'm trying to do in the book is say that these things are interconnected. And also, if you think about them holistically, sometimes it's easier to solve problems when they're bigger rather than smaller, because you can have trade-offs. So if I'm an old person, I might be willing to spend more on early years education through my taxes if I know that you're putting in place a care system that will look after me, or a better system of care insurance that will look after me. And so I guess sometimes looking at the political trade-offs in a holistic way might make it easier to solve these problems.
Yeah, that's very good. I'll look for questions from the audience. The first hand I saw was here. Yep, madam, if you want to stand up and ask your question. Go ahead and ask it. I think we can, well, we won't wait for the microphone. Go ahead. Yeah.
Love to see the early childhood education stuff. There's irrefutable evidence to support everything you said there. But how do you convince governments in a four-year election cycle to invest in something that won't pay dividends, but you hope will pay dividends? You know what I mean? Right? The evidence is all there, but it's always left behind. So is there a country that's doing it really well?
Yeah.
And what advice do you have for policy?
Yeah, no, that is the problem with the early years stuff. Has two problems. One, it's very long term, and two, it doesn't fit into a ministry, right? It's like a combination of health and education and community development, and it cuts across traditional government boundaries. So those are the two reasons why countries underinvest. There are some countries who invest more in the early years. As always, the Scandinavians are always the best. And I guess, and it's also very vulnerable. In the UK, we had a great program called Sure Start, which was, community health workers going to visit families with young children to help parents with nutrition and activities and stimulation. They never did a baseline. They never did a randomized controlled trial. And when austerity hit post-financial crisis, it was one of the first things that got cut. And so I think one important lesson is, even though the evidence is so overwhelming, and if you read my book, there's 100 footnotes of studies on early years interventions and the incredibly high rates of return. I mean, 17 to 1 on average globally, phenomenal rates of return. And huge increases in lifetime income as a result of them. That I think I think there is an evidential, the evidence is there, but policymakers are not aware of it. And I think you're right about the vulnerable. I mean, I would love to just I shouldn't say this because I'm an economist, and economists hate earmarking, but there has to be a way to protect those budgets in times of crisis, to make sure that those investments are protected, because it's a multiplier. So if you invest in early years, every investment you make in education has a higher return. If you invest in early years, every investment you make in health has a higher return. And in the end, it will save you money. So I think one has to keep making that case.
Ito Peng has a question.
Oh, and I'll just add one other thing. And if you don't have a lot of money to spend, target it on poor kids. Just spend it on the poor kids. If you can't do everybody, just do the poor kids, and then it becomes more affordable.
Thank you very much, Minouche, for really excellent presentation. And your argument about how our social and economic and physical infrastructure is broken, and that we need new social contracts makes a lot of sense. I also like your 3 recommendations. And I wonder if you could elaborate for us a little bit more about those 3 recommendations. For example, maximum investment in capabilities makes obvious sense, and that makes, and I could see concretely how that could translate into actions. For basic income floor, I would love to hear a little bit more, because we know from Norwegians and Finnish experimentation with basic income did not work very, very well. If you could elaborate on that a little bit more. And then finally, managing risk, sort of better balance of risk management. How would you go about doing that?
Yeah. So let me start with the maximum investment in capabilities. So I'll give a couple of examples of what policies could look like to make that happen. First, a lifelong learning entitlement. So if, I'm going to throw out some numbers. If we gave every 18-year-old, let's call it 30,000 Canadian dollars for life, that they could spend on their skills. And they could spend it on university if they wanted, but they could also spend it on vocational skills. And you would even out the playing field, so that at the moment in many countries, the people who stay in the educational system the most get the biggest subsidy. And the kids who drop out get the least support. But if everybody got the same entitlement from day one, that would be a way to even out opportunities and invest in the capabilities of everyone. The second thing I'd mention on maximum capabilities is the capabilities of women. So for the first time in human history, more women finish university than men. And that's not in the advanced economies, that's globally. That's in Africa, that's in Asia. And yet we still don't have care systems that enable that female talent to be used in the labor market. And so if you want to take advantage of the capability of all of those educated women, you need a much better infrastructure of care. So just like we have an education system and a health system, we need a care system that's properly funded and properly used so that more women can stay in the labor market. This is also critical for aging societies. Why did Japan, for the first time, start to focus on getting Japanese women in the labor market? Because their pension system is unsustainable unless they have more women contributing to the welfare system. So those are the kinds of policies I would think would be really important for maximum investment and capability. On risk sharing, I'll give it a good example from Canada. I think it's the Canadian Post Office that has now developed what they're calling a collective defined contribution pension scheme, which is so smart, which basically says each individual can have their own defined contribution pension pot. So you'll have a pot that's yours with your name on it, but we're going to manage it collectively, because if we manage it collectively, the administrative charges are far less, you'll have professional management, and you can share the risks more rationally. So I don't want to nerd out among pension people, but if you have a pension usually what you're told is when you're young, invest more in equities, and when you get older, invest more in bonds. But you may get old at a time when bond markets are in a terrible state and where returns on bonds, as we've recently experienced, were very low. If you're managing this pool collectively across people of many age groups, you can achieve much higher returns for everyone, because some people will be young and some people will be old, and you can pool that risk across a bigger population. So that's another really good example of a better social contract by using collective defined contribution schemes, and a much better way of sharing risks.
Next question. Oh, please, go ahead. Yeah, we'll bring the microphone to you. And the best part of that Canada Post pension is that it comes with direct deposit. You don't have to wait 3 to 14 days for the check to arrive in the mail. So,
Yeah. It's a really good model.
Please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. So I was wondering around this idea of the better social contract, who gets to be involved in developing that, and what does that look like? And how much do we rely on governments and existing systems, which I think leave out and tend to leave out a lot of people? And then how do we really ensure that everyone who we envision to be a part of this better social contract actually has a stake in making it happen?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So if you look historically, social contracts tend to be renegotiated either in a time of crisis or because of huge pressure from social movements. So if you think about, say, in the UK, when the National Health Service was created, it was after World War II, there was a sense that we owed all those people who had sacrificed in the war a better prospect, and so hence the founding of the NHS. Or in the US, the New Deal came on the back of the Great Depression. I had thought, to be frank, I thought COVID was enough of a crisis to make people realize that we needed a better system of providing social insurance and protection. It doesn't seem to have played out that way yet, although I don't think we're done yet. If you remember the 2008 financial crisis, it took years for the populist backlash to that to emerge. And so COVID might be part of a demand for a better social contract. But so one option is crises, but a slightly more peaceful option is the power of social movements, and social movements demanding change. Part of the problem in many democracies is that obviously power is very unevenly distributed, and social movements often don't work very effectively. One of the things that frustrates me is how young people, you're a young person, don't use their political power as much as they should because they don't vote as much as old people. And so, why do our fiscal systems, why are they so biased toward providing transfers to old people? Is because the old people vote and they look after their interests. So we do need to find, it is linked to this question of how do we make our democracies work better? And how do we give voice to as many people as possible? There is no doubt that political systems that have proportional representation, for example, tend to have better social contracts than winner-takes-all presidential or parliamentary systems. Because if you have to have a coalition, you have to look after more people. And so that results in a more generous social bargain. So those are some of the factors. It's about our democracies, it's about our social movement, and crises can help.
Thanks very much. The second row right here, please.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I was just wondering about our social expectations. When we're looking at social mobility, I think it's always seen as more is better. We need a bigger house, so we're doing better than our parents. We have more money, bigger house, more cars. And I'm wondering about whether that has contributed, well, it has contributed, I think, to our environmental crisis. But, even happiness sort of surveys throughout the world have said, up to a certain level of income, you're happy, and beyond that, it doesn't necessarily make a difference. So I don't know whether we should be looking at, our social expectations, and then it, would sort of filter down in terms of our social objectives and our contract. Maybe we're not looking for the right things at the end of the day. Maybe quality, more quality than quantity is something we should be considering.
Well, I very much agree with that. And I think a lot of the work now that's being done on well-being and happiness points to that. I mean, the surveys around the world about what we call subjective well-being are very clear that what makes people happy. First and foremost, physical and mental health. Second, the quality of their relationships. And third, whether they have meaningful work. Income is like number 9 on the list. And so it's definitely true that those are the things that are the most important for well-being. And some countries are starting to use those measures to measure social progress. Yeah. But you're quite right that people's expectations and the role of the media and social media in altering their expectations are really counterproductive. I read a very interesting paper, just a slight detour, by an economist at the LSE who's recently written a book, I think it's called Love, Money, and Parenting. And he looks at how the rise of income inequality in the US, in countries like the US, the UK, and places like South Korea, has meant that because there's increasing inequality, the returns to education have gone way up. So it really matters that your child get highly educated in order to have a decent life and achieve social mobility. And that is the explanation for helicopter parents. And that in those societies, that kind of intense parenting of, the kid has to have 8 extracurricular activities a week, and the pressure for tutoring and those poor children having serious mental health issues in places like Korea and the US is driven by that. Whereas if you live in a sort of egalitarian society like Sweden, parents are very relaxed, and like the kids don't go to school till they're 7, and nobody does any extracurricular activities because the pressure on social mobility is much less, because your kid's going to do fine, whether they have 8 extracurriculars or not, because the society is such that most people get looked after and have a decent standard of living. So it's affecting, even the way we parent.
As the parent of young kids, there's good news and bad news in that answer. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Question, yes, madam in the back.
Thank you. I have so many questions. This was great. I'm looking forward to reading the book, actually. But I want to pick up on the question about the income floor and the political will kind of thing.
Yeah.
Because what strikes me, I'm the chair of the Basic Income Canada Network. So that shows you what side of this I'm on. But we've done a lot of work in Canada, and it's another one of those areas where the evidence actually is overwhelming that this works. And it works in Canada for younger and older populations. So your graph there is really interesting. But the problem is, during that working age adult period, we all experience life too. We have kids. We get a disability, we might get over it. We get ill, we get over it. We lose a job, we transition if we can, and very often we don't, because our social systems are set up so that we just wait for people to fall, and then when you fall low enough, it's just really bad. But in so much of the work that we've been doing politically with people, what so much of it comes down to is not the economic arguments at all. There are all sorts of red herrings out there. It comes down to who's part of the social contract. And what we hear over and over again is those people who have fallen through the cracks are those people. They are somebody else, and they should be somebody else's problem. They have somehow failed. And that psychological deserving, undeserving paradigm is just incredible. And I don't know how you get over that, because study after study shows that with some security, with some income, people can train, they can go back to school, they make success of their lives with those opportunities. So was that a question? I don't know.
Yeah, no, so I would be interested in seeing the Canadian evidence, because what I've seen on universal basic income, well, first let me say, if you're going to do a high-level universal basic income, you need to increase taxes a lot to be able to give people a meaningful amount. And I just think politically that's, if you're going to raise taxes by 20% of GDP in order to give transfers to everybody of, let's call it, I don't know, I'm going to make up the numbers, but sort of $2,000 a month, it's very difficult politically to imagine that happening. If you give smaller transfers, then it isn't really, you can't live off of it. It's a supplement to your income. Then I think the evidence is that it makes people a little bit happier, their well-being improves, but it doesn't really change their economic behavior. If they were unemployed, they stay unemployed. If they were employed, they stay employed. That at least I haven't seen a lot of evidence that it fundamentally changes people's economic behavior, but it does improve their well-being a little bit. But on your point about the other, I think it's really interesting. I mean, Canada's a bit more enlightened on immigration, but it's really interesting to see how the debate of immigration, like what support should you give an immigrant? And that's exactly what you're saying. When does this person get to join our social contract? That's what the debate is. Why is it always about access to public housing and access to schools? Because you're basically saying when someone gets to join your social contract. And I think it's why I tend to prefer transfers which are linked to employment or education, because I think politically that's easier to sell. So that's why, for example, the lifetime educational endowment, I think is a more sellable proposition than, say, what Piketty suggests, that everybody get a wealth endowment when they turn 21. And that wealth endowment would be like 125,000 euros is the number I think he uses. And that you could use it for anything. Now, I think politically that's a really hard sell. But I think if you said to people, I'm going to give you $50,000 for your whole life for skills and education, I think that's a viable sell, actually. I think similarly, if you said, I want you to work, I want you to contribute in some way, but if your wage is very low, and you can't lead a decent life with that wage, I will top up your wage. So if you earn, let's say, if your skills only enable you to earn $500 a week, and you need $750 to lead a decent life, the state would supplement it with $250. Because then you get away from this, oh, you're just getting money for doing nothing problem that some of the universal basic income proposals advocate. And I think that is more, even if someone is not very productive at all, I think if they, I guess I still hold on to the belief that everyone has something to contribute, even if it's visiting an elderly person in their home and having a conversation and keeping them company and being paid to do that. That is a social contribution which we could pay for and would be better than just a cash transfer in advanced economies. I should clarify what I'm saying. I've worked on many low-income countries, and in many low-income countries, there are pure cash transfers to very poor households, which are super effective. And I just think the problem in advanced economies is a little bit different, because you can target more in a rich country. If you're in Malawi, 80% of households are poor. There's no point in targeting. You may as well just make it universal.
Other questions? Carolyn Tui.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your presentation. In the previous session, we talked about the necessity of building social consensus, getting around the tyranny of the four-year electoral cycle really requires a broad consensus across the population, across parties. And I'm wondering about the grounds for a new social consensus. In your response to another question, you suggested change occurs in a crisis or due to the rise of a powerful social movement. The example of the establishment of the pillars of the British welfare state after the war, that was a crisis that was, although there were uneven effects, was experienced across the population as an existential threat. Most of the crises either fast or slow moving, that we now experience have very differential effects across the population, whether it's the pandemic or the energy transition or technological change. I guess the one thing that doesn't, although it's a slow moving crisis, is the aging of the population. and although that differentiates across generations in a life cycle context, it has more resonance. Where have you seen, or just what do you think are the grounds for a social consensus around the kind of new social contract that you're advocating?
Yeah, I mean, you're right that that resistance is very, very high. There are very, you're right about, if you think about the World War II, that was a shared experience. And, many people would argue that, because rich people and poor people were in the trenches together or in the bomb shelters together, you had that sense of solidarity. In a weird way, again, I thought COVID would create a little bit of that solidarity because we all experienced it in some way. But you're absolutely right also that the consequences for us were very different depending on our circumstances. And that is a problem in many societies, that room for shared experience has been diminished in modern life, exacerbated by segregation, social segregation, physical segregation of different communities. And so that sense of solidarity has been lost. I mean, one interesting example, again, only because I was there last week, which I thought was fascinating, was in Singapore, where, as you probably know, it's a very multi-ethnic societies with Chinese, Malays, and Indians. And every building is socially engineered so that there's a mix of ethnicities in every building. And there are no poor neighborhoods in Singapore because 80% of the population lives in public housing, and rich and poor people live just next to each other. Now that's a very extreme example, but it fosters a sense of commonality and solidarity, which is kind of unusual. Some people, I'm not so sure. Some people think that, when we had conscription, that served a similar purpose, and that maybe we should restore some obligation for community service as a way to recreate that sense of solidarity. Universities have a role to play by, recruiting young people from all sorts of different backgrounds and having them interact with each other. But I do think that we need to be thinking more about how do we create those opportunities because you're right that unless people, if you look at the U.S. these days, you can't hold a society together when people think that fellow citizens are the enemy. That's about the most fundamental break in the social contract. People have to have a sense of common purpose, and arguably we've lost that in some societies.
So COVID provides an interesting example just because, to not take the analogy too far, but in Canada, for what it's worth, by the end of the second year of COVID, by the end of 21, less than 10% of people had been infected. So not everyone had experienced it, but we didn't really go through it together in a sense. We were just sort of told, stay home. I think at the beginning there was this thought that we would enlist mass amounts of people in testing, and people would be enlisted into caring for other people. But the reaction of the government was, we'll spend every dollar we can to not have you leave your home and be as comfortable as possible and just take care of yourself in some sense, right? So the threat was not universally felt, and the response didn't have a lot of solidarity at the core, but there was rhetoric around wearing a mask to protect other people, but it seemed like a very blunt and non-social response, right?
It's very interesting. Yeah. So there's a really nice piece of research in The Lancet which looks at COVID infections and death and the relationship to trust in a society. And it's really compelling. The most important variable of how countries did during the pandemic was how much trust there was in that society. How many vaccines they used, whether they had lockdowns or not that important. But if you trusted the government and you trusted each other, your death rates were lower because people complied with voluntary guidance. They wore masks. They trusted each other to self-isolate when they were sick. And so it was a really good example of how high levels of trust and solidarity in a society have these huge other payoffs, which you don't necessarily expect.
Let's leave this on a high note. What's the most, if we wanted to look to a country that's doing one thing really well, you've talked a bit about Singapore, but what's the most sort of inspiring example you've seen of one element of a new social contract emerging somewhere? I hope it's not all darkness. There's
It's just, there are elements in different societies. So Singapore, I already mentioned the housing and the lifetime learning entitlement, which I think is very interesting. I think Germany has been really impressive in the way they've integrated refugees and immigrants in their society as a deliberate social policy in a way, with really intensive, Canada's also a really pretty good example of society that's got a very progressive and deliberate way of embedding people in the social contract and feeling like they have a sense of identity in place. So I think there are very good examples of changes in different countries. I'd be hard, every country, I think that's the other thing I should say, is that maybe that's where I would end, is that, the social contract is very, it's very specific to a society and its values. And it will look very different in different contexts. In many societies, the issue about caring for the young and the old, where I was born in Egypt, is still done essentially in the family. And so, you have extended families and often still multi-generational families living in the same household, and care gets managed within a family. And it kind of works a little bit. It's not so great for the women, so that's a problem. But that's, that social contract is relevant for that society. And so the answers are not cookie cutter. I was saying that, part of the social contract in Egypt is the government provides cheap bread. That's just part of the deal. Whereas in other societies, the expectation is around, transport or housing. And so each society will be different, but I guess what I really would love to see is more of a conversation around what it is that we want in our society as part of our social contract, and to what extent is education or healthcare or old age care part of it, and how do we balance these trade-offs? And I think every society will come up with its own answers, and that's okay. But what's not okay is pretending that we don't have a problem. And I hope I've persuaded you that there is a problem, but there are solutions, and we just need to figure them out collectively through our political system, through our social networks, through debates happening, even within the household, about division of labor within the household. Those are all every one of those conversations is part of the social contract. Admissions policies of universities, every one of those is part of thinking about how do we shape the social contract in our society. And I think it could be an exciting conversation.
It's been both inspiring and enlightening to have you here with us for the last hour, and so very kind of you to come and join us. So I'll ask everyone to join me in thanking Minouche Shafik.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you.